Hi there. Welcome to this week's episode of Waste 360's Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. My name is Charlotte Dreisen, and I am really excited to dive into the topic of material health today. This is a cursory first discussion on the topic. It's a topic I think we don't talk anywhere near enough about as a whole, not only in terms of how, materials and products and packaging that we use every day impact human health, our own health, and environmental health, but also how it impacts circularity and how it impacts whether or not we can or should recycle an item or compost an item. There are very real impacts, and we'll look into a couple today. We're going to start with Bpa and Pfas, two of the kind of biggest, most pervasive topics in material health. Bpa is one that folks may be familiar with. It's a topic that definitely, started to unfold in the early 2000s. Pfas is definitely a much more recent issue in material health that there is just starting to be more awareness and starting to enter the lexicon more frequently. But we're going to talk about both of those today as an example of how we should all be thinking about material health and what to be looking out for. So to start with, material health is a really important topic because it really governs whether or not a material or item we use is safe, both in terms of human health and environmental health. And we want to be thinking that about, of course, those elements in the use phase when we are interacting with products and packaging, but also upstream and downstream. So not only when we're engaging with them, but also when people who are extracting the material or manufacturing the item are engaging with that packaging, and also downstream when, someone who's dealing with the recycling or composting of that product or package is dealing with them, not only when we're interacting with them. So we want to be thinking about that whole supply chain, and not only, of course, the human impact, but also environmental impact. Sometimes materials will have impacts across both of those tracks, both human and environmental health, as well as on the full suite of the supply chain, upstream and downstream, as well as in the use phase. Other material health concerns and, items, chemicals, adhesives, coatings, colorants, inks, you name it, might only have isolated concerns. It might be totally safe and inert until the material is burned in a waste to energy facility. Or it might be, really nothing we have to be concerned with unless someone is interacting with it in a tactile manner or ingesting something from it, a package that we might touch, skin to package or take a sip from, if a beverage container. So it definitely varies, and it also varies by material. So there are going to be certain things you want to think about for paper items and for plastic and for metal. Glass, though, is one item that we can feel generally very good about, that it's not going to have any human or environmental health impacts in terms of its material health. Of course, there's going to be energy impacts and environmental impacts from that go into the manufacturing of glass and recycling of glass, just like all materials. But in terms of the material health, it is one of the only packaging materials that the FDA calls GRAS, G-R-A-S, or generally recognized as safe. Because it is so inert, and there really aren't going to be any interactions when we use it or drink from it or engage with it in that way. Other materials, though, we do always want to be cautious about, and a lot of material health concerns have pretty well articulated profiles for individual kinds of materials, but it's a really fast evolving field. There are new chemicals, created and invented and used in practice every day, and it is really hard for scientists and industry and consumers to keep up. This leads to one of the biggest reasons why material health is important, is because in the US, we have a very reactive and slow-moving and costly and time-consuming process to remove chemicals and material health concerns from use. Something has to be demonstrated to be really harmful over a long period of time with absolute certainty for it to be considered for being banned by the FDA, or to even at a voluntary level be something that companies elect to remove before they're regulated. That's not the same everywhere. In Europe, for instance, they have what they call the Precautionary Principle, which, if you're not familiar with, is basically the idea that you shouldn't use anything until it has proactively been demonstrated to be safe. In the US, it's the reverse. You can use whatever you want until someone demonstrates really thoroughly, really robustly that it's not safe to use. There are trade-offs to both of these approaches. This gives a lot more freedom to businesses and companies and people to use whatever kind of materials they want. and some of them, have great performance qualities, but the trade-off is that we don't always know that the chemicals and materials that we're using in packaging are necessarily safe, whether you're thinking about it from a human health lens or an environmental health lens. So the precautionary principle is something that it would be great to have a framework and structure around in the United States at some point in some distant future, but it is just not the reality today. There are very few pieces of legislation that govern material health for packaging and products as a whole. TSCA is one of the big ones to keep in mind, TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, and that really governs a handful of the most concerning materials that were found in packaging a long time ago, like PCBs and heavy metals, but it doesn't really have a broad scope. It's pretty narrow, all things considered. A couple states have introduced legislation recently, like Maine with PFAS, one of the two topic areas we're going to look at today, but it's really few and far between. Material health is not something that many jurisdictions have really gotten ahead about and regulated in any way, shape, or form, and really built muscle memory around, like we have started to with minimum percentages of recycled content in packaging or requirements for certain kinds of items to have to be recyclable or compostable. Material health is just much younger and greener. Jurisdictions just really haven't gotten around to that yet. And we're gonna dive into the first example and topic area we'll focus on today. So that's going to be BPA. This is something that folks are probably familiar with. If you don't know what BPA is, though, there's no reason you necessarily would. It is bisphenol A. That's the full name of the chemical, and it is used in two different applications primarily. It's used in some hard plastics. It's also used as a lining in some steel and aluminum cans. They're used for different reasons. So on the plastic side, BPA is used in some hard plastic applications like sippy cups and toys and baby bottles. Those are a few uses that it has been regulated for. So you can no longer use BPA in some of those hard plastic items, but you can find BPA in other hard plastic items today, albeit it is less frequent. On the lining side, BPA is used to prevent corrosion. So when we think about aluminum and steel cans, we think about really long shelf lives. People get a can of beans or a can of soup to last a long time. I know I stocked up in early COVID with lots of those items thinking, who knows how long the pandemic will be. This will be safe for many a year. And for that reason, cans really need to protect against the corrosive qualities of the food that's inside them, especially acidic foods like, tomato sauce or a lot of soup with tomato, just as an example of one thing that happens to be acidic. But there's lots of properties of many different foods that would have a corrosive quality in addition to just the moisture content. So BPA was used as linings pretty ubiquitously in metal, in steel and aluminum cans until it was demonstrated to have very negative human health impacts. And very much in the use phase. So when people were consuming food that they were taking out, whether using a can opener or peeling back a can lid. And it was not only concerning for adults, but also especially for children. As a whole, when you think about material health and different items that you might be concerned about or chemicals you might be concerned about, there's going to be a threshold that's safe for a human, for an adult human, where under that threshold, you're probably going to be okay. But for children, that threshold is generally much lower. So in a level of interaction with a chemical of concern that might be okay for an adult like me might not be okay for me when I was 5 years old, or someone who is on the much younger side. So that's one element to be cautious of. And for BPA in particular, every kind of material health concern will have, of course, different human and environmental health impacts associated with it. But BPA is very much known for having reproductive harm and having carcinogenic qualities as a whole. So definitely not items that we want to be ingesting or, having present in our blood and lots of other fluids in our body. BPA has been measured at for, no matter where you live or how old you are. So most people have BPA, unfortunately, in their bodies in some way, shape, or form today. When consumers really started to speak out about BPA and companies started to listen and recognize that they needed to phase it out of their packaging, they often shifted to BPS. This is another one of the big themes that we want to think about in material health, is safer alternatives. So just because we know that BPA isn't safe, doesn't mean necessarily that what we're switching to is going to be safer. In fact, it might be worse or might have really similar health consequences to the item and material or chemical that we were using in the first place. This is a great example of this happening. BPA, very harmful. Turns out its cousin BPS was also really harmful, had very similar chemical structures, very similar characteristics and health outcomes. So when folks shifted from BPA to BPS, they really weren't done. They, once studies were conducted and people were, pointing out that BPS was just as harmful, companies then had to rethink, okay, what's actually going to be a safer alternative, not just a different material to use that consumers weren't concerned about. So for BPA and BPS, for instance, a lot of companies have since turned towards non-BPA acrylics, other epoxies, and olefin polymers have all been different substitutes that they've been able to use in that kind of can lining, metal lining application, just for example. But not only do folks really want to think about what they're switching to, but also the rate of change. So just because folks are pointing out that a material or a chemical is concerning doesn't mean necessarily that there's going to be change or change fast. Over the course of the past 7-8 years, there's been pretty meaningful change and reduction in BPA linings, but it's not something that's been really regulated in any robust way, shape, or form. So unfortunately, it's all really been a voluntary effort, and companies have had to kind of figure out on their own what are safer alternatives and how to phase that out of their manufacturing and supply chains and the product portfolios that they have, and ensure that the can is going to be, have just as long of a shelf life. They know that their consumers wouldn't be happy otherwise if, they went from having a 2-year shelf life for a can of soup to having a 2-month shelf life. That wouldn't be probably an acceptable alternative. That would be a really reasonable substitute. So over the course of the past 7, 8, 9 years, there's been a reduction of the amount of cans on shelves with BPA or BPS linings that went down from, being nearly ubiquitous, almost 100% of cans, to now having north of 95% of cans having phased out BPA or BPS, which is really phenomenal progress to see. And we feel good generally about those alternatives as being safer. A great example of kind of an unfortunate substitute, a lack of a safe alternative, also is definitely occurring on the PFAS side of things. So PFAS may not be an acronym you're familiar with. If you are, that's great. There is a whole constellation of similar acronyms. PFAS stands for per and fluoroalkyl substances. It is a tongue twister even for those of us who say it on a somewhat regular basis. But PFAS is essentially a family of chemicals that are perfluorinated. They have a lot of fluorine chains, fluorine molecules in their composition. And what that does is that makes them spectacular grease and moisture resistant substances. So they're used in a lot of applications where you don't want moisture or grease. That can range from anything like a firefighting foam to waterproof jackets, lots of products, and paper packaging is a big one. The paper food serviceware that we all use and love in lots of different applications for, anything from a paper plate to a popcorn bag to a pizza box. There is PFAS in a lot of those items because PFAS is so good at its job of preventing grease and moisture from seeping through a paper construct. Paper is not the only kind of packaging material that PFAS shows up in. There are some very isolated instances where it's used in compostable plastic like PLA, and some other instances, but it's very, very minimal. Paper is generally the material that we want to be concerned about when we're thinking about PFAS. Back in the early 2000s, 2 specific kinds of PFAS, it's a family of more than 10,000 chemicals, and PFOS, PFOS, and PFOA, PFOA, are 2 very particular ones that were what we call long-chain fluorine chemicals, long-chain PFAS. So they do the best job of preventing moisture and grease in giving moisture and grease resistance properties in packaging and products. But of course, they were found to have correspondingly the worst human health impacts. So when it comes to PFAS, they also, much like BPA, have carcinogenic qualities. They also disrupt liver enzymes. They impact, immune system responses. They impact a lot of different bodily systems. You only have to do a quick Google search to get a wild download on all of the negative human health impacts that PFAS has. There are some alternatives out there, but there aren't alternatives for every packaging application. There are for many. They are all much like alternatives to BPA in metal can linings. They are more expensive than PFAS. PFAS is really good at what it does, and it's really cheap. So a lot of companies are struggling with finding alternatives that work the way the old ones did and finding ones that are in the rough ballpark price-wise, but there's a lot of innovation and focus on changing them. But rewinding to when we started to identify, almost 20 years now, that the first most hardcore kinds of PFAS were concerning for human and environmental health, the FDA regulated those 2. But of course, it's a family of thousands of PFAS chemicals. So there are still a ton in use today. And instead of those long chain PFAS chemicals that FDA regulated, we now use medium and short chain PFAS chemicals. So they have fewer fluorine bonds, fewer fluorine links and in molecules in the overall composition of the chemical. But conversely, people have to use more of it to get the same performance qualities. So regulating that isolated instance or two of the really robust, really bad long chain PFAS chemicals inadvertently made people use more of the lower key kind. If something is only half as powerful, you're going to have to use twice as much. And the fact that those short and medium chain PFAS molecules are smaller physically, they actually are more water soluble. And now when they end up in soil or compost, if you're composting packaging with PFAS in it, it's soluble and it goes up the roots of plants and into the fruit. And that, in cases of plants that produce food that we consume, means that we're going to be consuming those chemicals. So PFAS isn't something that we want to interact with and touch in any way, shape, or form, but it certainly is extra concerning for items that we want to compost, knowing that compost is introduced back into soil, especially in a lot of organic and farming applications that are going to be growing food we then consume. PFAS is bioaccumulative and it does not break down in nature. So that is why kind of the human health impacts are pretty severe and the environmental health impacts are persistent because they aren't going to be going anywhere. You might have heard them referred to as forever chemicals. So PFAS is one that, is definitely more recently risen to the scene, but certainly there are some companies that have done a great job of going out and getting ahead of issues with PFAS. Coop in Denmark, a Danish grocery chain, is one great example of this. They have fantastic snacks. If you're ever in Denmark or some of their other markets in Scandinavia and Europe, highly encourage checking them out, not just because they are such advocates on material health, but when their packaging engineers realized that they were using PFAS and that PFAS was concerning in their microwave popcorn bags, the next day they pulled them off the shelf. That is a super severe, vulnerable move to make as a company. That is not easy to make that decision, nor is it easy to get people out in stores to remove hundreds and thousands, tens of thousands of boxes of popcorn. But they did it. And instead of replacing the shelf and just kind of making it seem like nothing was ever the case, they put signs on the shelf saying, we will not be selling popcorn until we can figure out a safe alternative for PFAS and ensure that our packaging is safe, which is a really great way to build trust with consumers and to demonstrate that they are genuine in their commitment. They weren't sweeping under the rug, but they were using a material that was harmful and forgetting about it. They were very transparently, proactively communicating that and in figuring out a better alternative. Since then, they've also been really active in advocacy in Denmark to try and regulate out PFAS from similar products and packaging. Microwave popcorn is kind of that iconic ideal that, popcorn is super greasy and buttery, needs a lot of grease barrier, moisture barrier. Some products use PFAS for moisture, some use it for grease, others use it for both. Something like a pizza box is typically going to use a lot of PFAS because they want to ensure that, the greasy pizza isn't seeping through the cardboard and making the pizza look more unhealthy than it needs to be, kind of from an aesthetic perspective, not so much a functional one, knowing their consumers are not interested in being, self-perceived as unhealthy consuming that product. Others, like a paper plate, if you're at a barbecue, needs to be really strong and hold up from that grease and moisture of whatever you're putting on top of it, and it's more of a functional issue. So there's a whole range of perspectives and definitely active work on trying to get it out of products and packaging. For compostable items that we want to be extra concerned about, we don't want to be introducing items with PFAS into the recycled paper supply, but especially on the composting side, when we know that material is going to be composted and turned into soil amendment, we want to be extra cautious. BPI, the North American Standard for Compostability Certification, has gone really above and beyond the standards that ASTM sets out for compostability to add requirements that packaging that's made of paper that gets certified do not have measurable quantities, meaningful quantities of fluorine present, which is a marker for PFAS. Anything that has, PFAS in it will have a whole lot of fluorine. So that's a great example. If you want to be, proactive and ensure that you're not using paper plates or paper packaging that has PFAS even if you don't intend on composting them, ensuring that you're buying certified, BPI certified compostable packaging is a great way of doing that. But certainly something that we're being more and more cognizant of and building more internal capacity into. And I think it's going to be posing a real question for recycling programs about whether they're going to continue accepting all the same items, paper items that they, have accepted for many, many years. One other kind of paper item to be mindful of is with BPS, knowing that BPS, an alternative that was used in the linings of metal cans for some time after BPA was kind of called out as a harmful material. BPS is used on thermal printing paper, so anything like a receipt or an airline ticket, if you kind of see the sheen on that kind of paper. BPS though is of course soluble to water, to touch, concerning both from just interacting with it and also once you have touched BPS and receipt paper, an airline ticket, to touch your mouth or interact with your body with your hands after touching it. So also wanting to make sure that items, that are paper that have other material health challenges, not just PFAS, don't end up in the recycled paper supply is another big priority. So no one should be, introducing receipts into their blue bin, their recycling bin, whatever kind of color bin you have, and definitely wanting to make sure that we're keeping our stream as clean as possible. Those are just two examples. Material health is such a robust topic, and depending on the kind of material and the product and that vertical and where you are, there are going to be all sorts of different hosts of concerns, but I hope we touched on a few of the big themes that are important to be cautious of, whether the precautionary principle or finding safer alternatives, and thinking about the consequences both up and down the supply chain, in addition to that, that use phase that so many of us interact with packaging and products with more often than not. But that's it for now. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. Please feel free, as always, to leave comments, questions, thoughts on this video right below on Waste360's website, or to reach out on Twitter @CharDreisen or on Instagram @CharRecycles. See you next time.